In the bayous of South Louisiana, Jim Crow was rooted in sugarcane fields and rice farms. A plantation aristocracy ruled there until the 1960s. Blacks in the region recall harsh times. As for the whites, anthropologist Kate Ellis spent a year in Iberia Parish and found that they remember the Jim Crow past in a very different way.
Most of the older whites I spoke to remember growing up in a culture where there was simply no question. Blacks were inferior and treated as such. Others remember segregation as a more benign arrangement.
All the black people who lived in a small town like this, everybody knew everybody else.
Right.
Except we didn't know the colored people that well. But I think they all knew the white people.
Really?
And they looked up to the white people, I tell you.
They did.
Because they knew that's where their bread was buttered. You know, the white people helped them, gave them work and everything.
This tape is with Mary Laveau. She asked me not to use her real name. Mary's lived her entire 91 years in Iberia Parish and belongs to one of the old plantation families. She doesn't remember blacks resenting the rules of Jim Crow. For example, she says blacks chose to sit in the back of the bus.
It was just part of their life. They understood that, it looks like. I don't think that the white people just were cruel to them and made them do that.
Yeah.
But they just felt that that was part of them.
So it wasn't something that white people were doing to...
The white people, I think, were good to them.
Mary was raised by a black nanny and surrounded by black tenants on her family's plantation. She says the black people who worked for her family were poor but happy.
And they had a little church back there, and they would sing the most beautiful gospel music, sing, you know.
Oh,
they had
yeah.
beautiful voices, some of them they'd sing. And sometimes we'd go there at night and park about a block away just to listen. They just had that rhythm.
So it was kind of joyous, the music.
Oh, yeah. Oh, they'd play the music and dance.
Mm-hmm.
And their way of life, I think they were happier than the white people because nothing worried them, you know. Some white people, they were worried sometimes about losing their land or trying to make things go, you know, they were the leaders. But the black people, nothing bothered them.
New Iberia lies deep in South Louisiana's bayou country, where the night is filled with sounds from the swamps. It's a small town, just 35,000 people. About a third of them are black. This part of the state is called the Sugar Bowl because sugar cane is the primary crop. On the main street, you can still find some of the antebellum homes that belonged to the plantation gentry, complete with white columns and towering oaks. Some of the homes belong to the great-grandchildren of the plantation owners.
Well, my name is Barra, Leonard Barra Jr., and my connection with New Iberia is I was born here in 1917 on East Main Street. That was very segregated, without a doubt. From the time I grew up, they had white folks and black folks, and basically black folks worked for the white folks. They sort of lived in their part of town, and we lived in our part of town.
And why was it that way?
It's I guess if you didn't grow up here, it would be difficult really to understand that it was two separate worlds, you know. You just didn't become part of their world. You didn't go into their houses. They worked in your house, but it was just the way it was. It had always been that way.
Leonard Barrow is a retired fighter pilot who returned to New Iberia after a long military career. He comes from a planter family that always had close contact with blacks, first as slave owners, then as employers, always as superiors.
God, there was a fellow worked for my father for a number of years in a rice field, and we ran into each other one day, and boy, he came and threw his arms around me, you know. Now, this is another funny thing. You wouldn't have dreamed of shaking hands back in those days.
The black man that you ran into, or your father?
My father or me would not have dreamed of shaking hands with a black person.
Some whites that I talk to say blacks were never treated poorly during Jim Crow. They were always treated well. They had their place and we had ours, but they were always treated well. I'm wondering how you see that. If
Well,
you would agree with that.
Being treated well, I guess, has a pretty broad spectrum of. The blacks definitely lived at a much lower standard, much lower. Many of the houses didn't have running water. Many of the houses didn't have electricity. Heat was rudimentary. Of course, nobody had air conditioning.
Do you remember any whites openly questioning the way things were?
Certainly not. Oh, heavens no. Why? Why would they have questioned it? I mean, this is the way it was. You grew up. You know, it's kind of like I'm a Catholic because my parents were Catholics. I never questioned why. That's the way it was.
What about blacks? Do you remember blacks ever
Raising the question?
Yes.
No. No. They knew their place.